it was a long period of austerity and cutbacks in the name of what was called neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is the idea and the policies and program of privatizing the public sector. So you had this period, the post-war boom, where the labour movement gained influence and where Keynesianism was the capitalist response. Keynesianism is, if you like, state intervention economically in order to prop up and support the development of capitalism. And in the post-war boom, Keynesianism was the dominant economic philosophy, so dominant that the Conservatives, the Liberals and the Labour Party all supported it. And so too across the whole of Western Europe. Keynesianism, the welfare state, provision for people who fall by the wayside of capitalism, and intervention by the government in the event of capitalist crisis was the dominant economic and political paradigm after the Second World War from 1945 until about 1980. Then came the so-called neoliberal attack, where they said that we've gone too far, the trade unions are too powerful, the working class are becoming lazy, capitalism can't make a profit unless you privatize those public sector institutions and property, for example, council flats, the NHS, the steel industry, the coal industry, education, all those sectors of the economy that have been taken out of direct control by the private sector, that have been taken out of profit-seeking motivation, all those sectors, even though they were serving, for example, if you've got a publicly funded NHS, you could say that's a socialist policy. You could say that. And certainly it is socialist to have provision for anyone regardless of how much money they've got. On the other side, you could also say it's a provision within capitalism that is to provide a subsidy by the public to the private sector to guarantee the health of the population, by the state to provide the workforce healthy, in the case of the education system, educated, in the case of higher education, a layer of managerial people funded by the state who can provide, if you like, those skills to the private sector. So on the other side you could say public sector intervention is a subsidy for the private sector. But by funding the public sector welfare state, you're also taking out of the sector of accumulation, of private accumulation, you're taking part of the economy away from their hands. And so after 1980, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and then their acolytes and supporters, regardless of the political party, suddenly they all sided the opposite way and all said as much privatisation as possible. A public-private partnership. So for example, in the NHS, if they wanted to borrow money to build a hospital, instead of spending 20 or 100 million pounds on 4 or 5 hospitals, paid for by the public from taxpayers' money, they would make a private-public partnership, spend £1.5 billion, and the public would subsidise the rape and robbery of the public sector. And so lots of public officials, lots of bureaucrats, lots of public sector workers felt they were under a ferocious neoliberal attack against the living standards of the working classes, which didn't only break out in Britain or America or Europe, but spread then across the entire planet. At that time, they used to say that the IMF, Joseph Stiglitz, for example, worked for the World Bank. The IMF and the World Bank would go from country to country, and they'd have a template prepared on a computer, and they'd just enter a little bit of data for each country. Then they would go to the government of Thailand, the government of Indonesia, the government of India, the government of Pakistan, the government of Brazil, fill in a couple of core information data, and then go to them as you must privatise healthcare, education, welfare, housing, you name it, water, electricity, gas, public monopolies, they must all be privatized. Transfer the money to the private sector, enrich the few, and then they will trickle down bits of the economic surplus to the benefit of the people. That was the trickle-down economy, Margaret Thatcher, neoliberalism, from the year 1980, then 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union. They went to Russia, and to the other former Soviet countries. And again, the same template. Jeffrey Sachs was the man. He went to Poland, a 500-day plan to privatize everything. They went to Romania, to Hungary, to East Germany. Everything had to be privatized. And so they accumulated. Imagine, the East Germans had built East Germany as a public sector entity. Suddenly, all of it was handed to West Germany for free. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Russia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, all of the property there was handed to the multi-billionaires externally and internally. A few people, I remember meeting someone, he was working for the government at the time. And they basically said to 20 people in the government and around the Moscow Komsomol, the Communist Party youth, they said to them, the chosen people, Abramovich, Khodorkovsky, or the Bezerovsky, all these people, they were young communists. And they said to them, we will give you the entire wealth of Russia, the entire wealth of the former Soviet Union. In each republic they did the same thing. And a layer of crooks in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, in Belarus, in Russia, all across the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, took ownership of their countries. And then they declared you got free elections. You can election of this guy, he's a multi-billionaire, funds this party. You can elect this guy, he's a multi-billionaire, funds this party. And they had slight differences, you know, tiny differences in policy. But actually all they did was throw dust in the eyes of the people and say, now you've got democracy, but you've got no property. You know, they said to them, in the 500-day plan in Russia. The IMF and the World Bank went to the Russians under Boris Yeltsin, who was a stooge of the United States of America. And they said to them, all of Russia will be given their property. They built Russia. They built the houses, they built the schools, the education, the hospitals, everything from the weapons industry until chocolate factories and cigarette factories were all publicly owned. So they handed them all, they said, you can own part of the country. So they said, here, you get a piece of paper that says you own 150 millionth of the country. So you got a piece of paper, a certificate, that they said was sharing the wealth out with everyone. But the people had no food. They had no means of existence. Their employment was wiped out. The factories were closed down. So what could they do? Along came Bezerovsky, Khodorkovsky, all the allies around the Ukrainian government, the Russian government, the Uzbeki government, and all the rest of the gangsters. They had money given to them by the banking system. And with that money, they went round knocking, they had boys knocking on the doors of the pensioners, of the unemployed. And they said, that piece of paper that says you own this house and 150 millionth of Russia, we'll buy it off you for $25. They had no money. They had no means of existence. And so they handed over their shares of the economy that have been built up by the population over 70 years for nothing. And in that way you got this elite layer of bureaucratic thieves who stole the entire wealth of these countries. And then of course you wonder why the Russians respond the way they do today. They were told in 1991, I remember I was in East Germany when they were making the negotiations, they said, East Germany can join West Germany, but NATO will not move 1 centimetre eastwards. Not 1 centimetre eastwards. And now we've got NATO on the border, surrounding Russia. Of course they think they're under attack. And they are under attack, there's no doubt about it. You know, don't forget a year and a bit ago, they said to we never intended to go there. We never wanted to go to Ukraine. Now the only talk is Ukraine must be part of the EU and Ukraine must be part of NATO. And we're launching the spring offensive. We are launching it. They no longer say Ukraine is launching it. We are launching it with our missiles paid for by you. Paid for by you. Your taxes are paying for the missiles killing the people in Ukraine. Your taxes, your money. And that's why the prices are going through the roof. You're paying for it. You're paying for the lack of gas. You're paying for the lack of electricity. They said, oh, well, this is the Russians' fault. Until we found out, as many suspected, that the Americans blew up the pipeline supplying gas to Germany and Europe. The Americans blew it up. And they planned to blow it up long before Russia went into Ukraine.
There is no evidence for that.
There is.
No.
Seymour Hersh's study.
No.
He analysed it and it's never been refuted by any officials in the West. No officials in the West. No officials in the West have been able to refute it.
No, that's not.
So what's true then?
No, the official version is...
The official version, yes, you believe what you like. If you believe the official version, my friend...
Which proof has what is called?
Seymour Hersh.
Okay.
He's one of the best known investigative journalists in the history of the world.
And what you say?
And nothing has been refuted by Joe Biden. Nothing of what he said has been refuted by any of the Western powers. It doesn't mean it's proof, but you ask yourself, if someone says this is what happened, and you blew up the pipeline, someone blew it up, right?
Sorry, sir. And,
you think the Russians blew it up?
We don't know.
You think? Use your brain.
Yeah, and
the Russians are supplying gas to Europe. They're making money out of it.
No.
They got diplomatic power. The supply of the pipeline was agreed by the then Chancellor of Germany, Gerhard Schroeder, and he was on the board of Gazprom, and they want to break that up. Now, the point about it is where people get confused. Is people think that the war against Russia by America and NATO is a war against Russia. Of course, if, as Seymour, let's put it like this, if, as Seymour Hersh says, and it's not been refuted, let's put it like this, to allow you that leeway. I accept we don't have 100% evidence. So I'll say if, I'm giving you the concession, if, thank you very much, I'm glad you're here to be miserable again. Not only over there, but here as well. Now, if Seymour Hersh is wrong, we can still ask ourselves the following. Why would there be an attack which results in a loss of living standards, a loss of energy resources for the Europeans? Who benefits? You know, once upon a time, people used to ask themselves, as the starting question, when something breaks out that we don't quite understand, che bono? Who benefits? Who gains? Who gets an advantage out of that? So you have to ask yourself, who benefits from cutting off the gas supply to Europe? Who benefits from the Europeans suffering? Who benefits from the war in Ukraine? It is the United States of America who benefits vis-a-vis not only Russia, but also the Europeans. The war is not against East Asia or Eurasia. The war is against the people at home. And if you don't realize that, you're blind. They launched a war against us. 3 years ago, they started a war against us. A war which said to be in the benefit of our health. They were looking after our welfare. They told us to stay at home.
Who's they?
They protect, they.
Who are they?
They, people unknown. I'll tell you who they are in a minute. I'll tell you who they are in a minute. Sorry?
Global.
Globally, yes. but they're dominated by one particular individual and a network of organizations that he controls. They're called the Bill Gates Network, the Gavi, and CEPI, and the World Health Organization. Between them, they invested 10 billion US dollars to control the pandemic response in every country. They controlled the pandemic response.
The Chinese government.
Sorry?
The government, the Chinese government.
The Chinese didn't do the same thing we did.
Oh, did they not?
No, they didn't.
Oh.
Anyone in China received an mRNA vaccine? No. They gave, very few people. They gave them traditional vaccines. Did they ban them from using hydroxychloroquine? No. They allowed them to use hydroxychloroquine. Did they say that everyone must get injected? No, they did not. The old people in China, very few of them, or better said, far fewer of them got injected. I received an email the other day, or message the other day from my doctor, come for your COVID booster. Now, how many here? I know lots of you have been injected with 1 and 2, but how many took a booster? Something made you think, I don't think so. Thanks for the invitation, but I don't think so. Maybe in your case, that's not the case. And I saw in the newspaper today, they're saying, well, we've got a real problem because we can't sell the vaccines we made. Surely the government should honour the contract and jab the people, but nobody wants to put their arm out and say, stick it in here. Nobody wants it anymore. So something was done to the population. They stuck a mask. There's a guy over there, I don't know if you saw him in the corner over there. He's got a mask all over his face. You can't even see he's got glasses and a mask. He's got no face left. We deprived children of the most elementary human contact. We wandered around the cities, ghost towns. We looked at the people's faces, nothing. Fear in their eyes. Fear is one of the major killers in the world. I put it to you that as many people died because of fear. And then they turned around and said, you remember we marched on the streets here? Hundreds of thousands, sometimes perhaps as many as 1 million took to the streets in Britain. None of it was advertised on the telly. None of it was promoted by the newspapers. It was underground networks. Telegram. People saying, come to this demo, come to that demo, go on the demo. And what did they do? You know, they go on about the demonstration last week. Not my king. Someone was arrested at Not My King. And that's a big story. Now the newspapers are all screaming, oh my God, how can the police arrest anybody? They arrested me 7 times in the pandemic. Piers Corbyn 15 times. This man here several times. They came for us, grabbed us, stuck us on the floor, beat us, chained us behind our backs, ripped great big marks in our arms. That's how our democracy functioned. And that was because you because you dared to leave your home. Because you dared to meet in a group of more than 2. Meanwhile, they had parties, celebrations, entertainment. They didn't believe a word of the shit they were telling you. And then they primed everyone.
What's this got to do
They
with
primed.
neoliberalism?
What's it got to do with neoliberalism? Because what happened was a layer within the capitalist class, internationally, particularly in Europe and America, they gained a dominant position after 2008 in terms of their argumentation as to how they should overcome the limitations created by the neoliberal era, which collapsed in 2008 with the economic crash. That economic crash in China, they invested billions and they developed their economy. Within 6 months of the crash, China was growing again. But the Western world went into a 10-year crisis. And that 10-year crisis meant Italy, in Spain, people like Cadiz wandering around, digging inside the rubbish bins to eat. In Greece, people, old age pensioners, going into Stigmata Square, blowing their brains out with a gun because they had no money to live on. The consequences of that economic crash meant that ideologically they had to create something new, create a new idea. So what was the idea? The idea was to have a new type of Keynesianism, new type of interventionism. The Chinese are driven
by an economic system in which public ownership dominates and drives the economy. So they thought, if what we do is we get the private sector to be subsidized by the state, massive state subsidies to develop the private sector, to carry out mission-based objectives. What are the mission-based objectives? They're entirely based on the idea that one, the government will subsidize the profits of the private sector on a massive scale. They will do this for the purposes of missions, mission-based capitalism. And mission-based capitalism will challenge China because somehow we need to defeat the Chinese. So they invented these two scams. One scam, climate change. The world's climate is being destroyed. There are forest fires, hot days in Thailand, hot days in America, and it's all caused by farts of cows, by people using cars, by industrialization, by modern world. All of this is destroying the planet, and a climate crisis is emerging. And that climate crisis means that the weather's bad, when there's a cold day it's shit, when there's a hot day it's shit. By the way, in case you didn't notice, yes, last summer was warm, but it's been the shittiest winter I can remember, and I'm 59 years of age. Winter was still going on this morning at 10 o'clock. It was freezing this morning when I went to work. Freezing. And it's been freezing since October last year. So why don't they go on about that? Why is it not how cold it is now? Oh, no. You've got to believe the story that in Antarctica, the ice is melting. The ice is not melting in Antarctica. Except this, they'll show you a picture on television. Not something you see around you here. They'll show you a television program with David Attenborough, and he'll be commenting on an iceberg collapsing into the water. And you're supposed to believe that the world is being destroyed by icebergs collapsing in the water in the North Pole. But of course, every single springtime, as the weather warms, the North Pole has icebergs collapsing into the water. Then they show you polar bears sitting on a block of ice, and you think polar bears are about to starve to death, stuck on a block of ice, isolated, unable to escape. How terrible. And you get little kids taught at school to burst into tears and go into a panic that the polar bears are about to die. Firstly, polar bears are not lovely, fluffy animals who you cuddle. Polar bears will eat you. Secondly, there are more polar bears now than there have been for decades. Thirdly, polar bears can swim 400 miles in the water. 400 miles in the water. So the idea that a polar bear on a block of ice is something scary is complete and absolute nonsense. Then they want to tell you that there are forest fires. Forest fires, they show you a fire in Australia. Every year, from time in eternity, there have been forest fires in Australia. Because the bush in Australia requires burning for it to grow again. Now, then they say there are forest fires in California. Why are there forest fires in California? Because the forest management system, whereby people always, historically, used to go into the woods and collect firewood and take it off the ground. That is a tinderbox if you don't take it away. They don't take it away anymore. They say leave it to nature, make it natural like it used to be back in the Stone Age. And in the Stone Age, by the way, people took the wood from the ground. So now, one lightning strike and a forest will start on fire because of their policies. By the way, a lot of the green people will turn around to you and say, or climate crisis people will turn around and say, oh, no, I don't use gas, I don't use electric. Instead of this, I don't use petrol. Instead of this, I burn log fires. What could be more organic than burning a log fire? George Monbiot in The Guardian published an article where he said, I apologise, he said, I didn't realise when I built my, I think it's a six-bedroom house entirely heated by log fires. This is the guy in charge of a lot of the propaganda in Britain and around the world around climate change. And he burns log fires. Did you know that every year more people die from burning solid fuels, burning wood inside their homes in Africa and India than die every year or died every year in the so-called pandemic, directly from the smoke they use to heat their homes or to cook, because they haven't got electricity and gas and petrol. Petrol and gas, you can't get any more precisely defined or definition of organic than petrol and gas. It is the very meaning of organic. They tell you carbon is a bad thing. There is no life on Earth that isn't based on carbon. Everything is based on carbon. They want to stupefy the population, make them scared of phantoms. One phantom, the microbe, put on a mask. Piers used to say, and I thought he was wrong at the time. And then you think about it, it's perfectly logical. You're often. But anyway, he said, if there was a danger from breathing in viruses in the air, God would have made a mask on your face. Animals would have developed masks on their face by natural development. Otherwise we would have died. Millions of years ago we would have died out. Surely we were following the science. But we weren't following the science. We were following the interests of a lobby group who wanted to scare the shit out of you all, to make you stay at home, to make you panic, to make you fear you're going to kill your grandmother, or your children are going to kill your grandmother, or you're going to die of some respiratory illness. And then, of course, they said, if you don't obey, then humanity will be wiped out like in the Spanish flu. Spanish flu is another fraud. Spanish flu occurred in 1918 to 19. They had no PCR test. They had no lateral flow test. So how did we know? We only know nowadays, don't we? How many of you took a lateral flow test last week? How many of you took a PCR test last week? So how do you know you're not all infected with COVID? The only reason we knew about COVID was because they said test for it. In reality, the entire program was controlled by CEPI, Gavi and the WHO to get a financial transfer from the public sector to the private sector in big tech and big pharma to take control of the world. That's what actually happened in the last couple of years. And the evidence for that is overwhelming. It's not my invention. And by the way, when the rebellion broke out in Europe, particularly in Britain actually, over mandates for healthcare workers, and the sympathy went out to the healthcare workers, why should they be injected? Why should you receive an injection? So then they dropped all the regulations. When did they drop the regulations? 3 days before they started the war in Ukraine. Anti-Semite is the universal catchword for everyone who opposes the governments of the world. They have carried out this program. Sorry? Diana, but the next one now. Anti-racist. The person who stood up against racism for 30 years. Now she's the anti-Semite supremo. Having said that, they paved the way for their own stupidity. Both Jeremy Corbyn and Diana, because they refused to oppose the madness that was imposed on the world. And to this day, they aren't questioning it. So they introduced a new type of Keynesianism, which was the vaccine Keynesianism and the climate Keynesianism, which is called the Great Reset, run by the World Economic Forum and their allies. So we need to go back to understand how to win the working classes to engage in struggle, to understand their condition, to understand science, to understand climate, to understand virology, or the rejection of virology, as some people here argue, to discuss all the scientific questions. Bertolt Brecht used to say, the working classes are children of the scientific age. That they need to rise up to that task and challenge the existing powers dominating the world. My voice is going, as you can hear, so I'm going to call a halt. Thanks very much. Piers Corbyn next. See you another time.
Heiko Khoo, thank you.